Okay, we're going to look at multiplying integers. If we have 2 times 8, that's the same as having 2 groups of 8, or 8 plus 8 to get 16. When we change to positive and negatives, really not much changes at all. Now we have 3 groups of negative 2. So if I drew my picture, I'd say I have 1, 2, 3 groups, and each one there are 2 negatives. So I have a total of 6 negatives. Like the next problem, I have negative 4 times 6. Seeing it in this way is confusing for me because what does a negative group look like? However, I can use my commutative property to change it to 6 times negative 4. Commutative property of multiplication states that no matter what order you multiply in, your answer won't change. So for instance, if I have 2 times 3, that is the same as 3 times 2. The same thing applies with positive and negative. So negative 4 times 6 is the same as 6 times negative 4. And now I can look at that and say, okay, when I look at that, I can see 6 groups of negative 4. So I have my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 groups, and in each group there are 4 negatives. You could draw each individual negative sign out if you wanted to, like before. And then I'd say negative 4 is negative 8, and negative 4 is 12, plus another negative 4 is negative 16, plus another negative 4 is a negative 20, plus another negative 4 is a negative 24. So having 6 groups of negative 4 is the same as having a total of 24 negatives. Where it starts to get confusing is when we have a negative times a negative. So looking up here, let's go back to the first one. We can see that when we had a positive, being 3, and we multiplied it by a negative 2 in this case, our product, or answer, was a negative. So we can see that a positive times a negative was a negative. If we look down here, we can see that we had a negative times a positive, and that was also a negative for this problem here. As we look down here, we go have a negative times a negative, and we have to decide what that will be. There's a couple ways to think about this. One, I can look at it and say, if a negative times a positive was a negative, then when I change this one from a positive to a negative, it must change my answer. So we could say a negative times a negative is a positive because it had to change when I changed that symbol. The other way to look at it is to say that this sign can always mean opposite. So, if we covered up the negative sign, we would have 2 groups of negative 5. Because the negative sign is there, we say, I don't have 2 groups of negative 5. I have the opposite, which is coming from this, the opposite of 2 groups of negative 5. And the opposite of 2 groups of negative 5 is 2 groups of positive 5. And 2 groups of positive 5 is the same as 10. So a negative times a negative is a positive.